Right, shall we begin the last of our sessions? The last of the formal panel sessions for today's proceedings is on eco-comparative futures. And I'll introduce our four speakers before handing over. So first we'll have Anna Reading, who is the Director of the Centre for Media and Cultural Industries here at King's College. After which will be Anne Collett of the University of Copenhagen. She is currently the Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Australian Studies Centre at the University of Copenhagen, but her continuing position is at the University of Wollongong in the English Literatures program. After which we'll have Stuart Ward, who is Professor at the Australian Studies Centre at the University of Copenhagen, but he tells me he has many roles and many hats, but this is the appropriate one for today. And finally, Astrid Rush of the University of Copenhagen. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. She's a PhD student looking at autobiographies of people living at the end of the British Empire. So I'll hand over.
Hi everybody. I'm one of those people that when Ian asked to put up our hands whether we were, it's our first encounter with Australian studies, I'm one of those people, okay? And I'm very pleased to be here. My area is really cultural memory and digital memory. And Ian said, would I talk a bit about a project that I've been involved in since spending 18 months in Australia. I'm relatively new to King's. I've been here 18 months. And I would say that the work that I do now, having spent that period in Australia, and I shared the same mailbox as the man who spoke earlier, Colin Harvey. Okay, so we had the same spider and the same daughter. We're married. And so we were both profoundly influenced by this experience. And actually, if I could make it compulsory for British academics to go and spend some time in Australia, I would. And one of the things certainly that I brought back, I think, with me was this sense of really wanting to work collaboratively. And I now find British academia very difficult in that respect, in that people tend to work or prefer to work more in an individual modality. So I've kept those collaborative relationships going with my colleagues in Sydney, and this is one of the projects that we're doing together and which has come out of that period of time in Australia. So the project then is really looking at what it is that makes up memory, and digital memory in particular. And it's tracing the global, or what I call the globital, this coming together of digitisation with globalisation, memory field that traverses the world and that has particular origins, as you will see in this paper, in Australia in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And just to kind of point the direction in that respect, this quote from Umberto Eco I think is really helpful. He says we have three kinds of memory. One is organic, which is the memory made of flesh and blood, and one administrated by our brains when they're working well. The second is mineral, and in this sense, humankind has known two kinds of mineral memory millennia ago. This was the memory represented by clay tablets and obelisks, and this second type is also the electronic memory of today's computers based upon silicon, or as we'll see in this paper, rare earths that come from Australia. We have also known other kinds of memory, the vegetal one and the one represented by the first papyruses, and then on books made of paper. So I want you to look at this slide and think about what you see and what it is that enables you to see it. One of the things that I see is the colour red. And I'm very interested in terms of how that red is brought to you on screen. I want us to take a journey where we're looking beyond the screen, where we're not simply thinking about this as an image, but thinking about where the image, the materiality of the image has come from, and the political economy in terms of the ecologies of our planet that may be damaged, that may be unearthed, that may be mined, that go into making this particular image. Now, this particular image, as most of you will realise, comes from Western Australia and is older than most things we know as an art form, as a memory, as a cultural memory. And largely, rock art is made through particular minerals, ochre that was transported, traded, commodified around Australia and within Australia over many tens of thousands of years. At the same time, though, that image is no longer simply ochre on a rock wall. It's also produced by and through all sorts of other kinds of materialities that go into the connectivities that give us digital memory, that has allowed that image to go from rock art to an image in a newspaper, to an image in an archive, to an image that I can simply Google and call up if I put in the words rock art. And what I'm going to suggest here is that process, that political economy chain that allows us to see the colour red, that allows us to see rock art, that brings rock art to here in this moment, has particular consequences. And it has consequences that are global and involves what Anna Tsing, in a fantastic book on coal, calls friction, and the process of friction that is involved in the commodification of particular minerals that go into making electronic goods. And these two guys here are two people that we've interviewed as part of a research project that I'm involved in with colleagues at Western Sydney, and they're involved in a project called Stop Linus. And as the name suggests, they're attempting to stop a company called Linus processing something called rare earths, which are essential to electronic goods. All of your iPads, iPhones, mobile phones, TVs that have nice bright coloured red that developed in the 1980s, that comes from rare earths that then are processed, and in the kind of commodity chain of processing, it then involves the residual materials of radioactivity that go into the environment and can damage communities and the environment in different ways. So this project that I'm involved in then is looking at the kinds of trajectories that are involved in digital memory that come out of Australia, that span the globe, and that we can think of in terms of the mobilisation of different cultural memories, starting with the mobilisation of an image of rock art. And the commodity chain is complicated and, as I've suggested, goes around the world. And one of those particular other commodity chains is gold and the mining of gold. And we can see with gold that it then goes back to Australia in various ways, and also then involves various frictions. So this is an image of a particular protest that took place here earlier in the year, and is protesting against Europe's largest gold cyanide mine. In order to produce the 320 million tonnes of gold that are now required in order to wire the internet, in order to wire our electronic memory and our digital memories, the mining of gold has had to increase exponentially over the past 5 to 10 years. And in the process, we have to use cyanide mining. And this particular mine in Romania will destroy 3 mountain tops, some Roman remains, so some much older memories, and 3 villages in the process of creating this massive open pit mine. So that's one bit of the commodity chain involved in the circulation of a piece of rock art around the world. This is the other end of that commodity chain, which for most pieces of electronic ware ends in China or ends in open cast pits, where our electronic goods, when they die, they are buried back under the earth. but about a quarter of them are then transported to China, which has the largest reprocessing places for our electronic goods. And the goods are stripped largely by women and children of wires that are then burnt and produces toxic fumes and causes diseases in the local population. So part of our work is also then involved in tracing that end part of the commodity chain. Digital memory also then involves these important fixed points that we don't really think about. We think of mobile memory, we think of our mobile phones, our iPads as something we can carry with us. But wherever it comes from, where it comes from, that rock art image has to go through what are largely termed server farms. And the rhetoric itself is really interesting in terms of the way in which it seeks to colonise a sense of this being ecological and green. So, you know, server farm or the cloud, you know, you can save your memories to the cloud, which is something that we might think that we all have access to, but as suggested in the previous talk, it's actually uneven, this connectivity. And it's not the case that this global memory is something in which cultural goods and cultural artifacts are evenly distributed. They're not, they're unevenly distributed. And everything goes through these nodes, which are these, in effect, server factories that guzzle up water, that guzzle up electricity. And what's interesting about this is that in Australia is actually at the forefront of rethinking server farms in a more ecological way, in rethinking how, within the context of Australia, sunshine can be used in terms of using solar power, and hot water can be reused that's generated from the cooling of these great server factories for local populations. And there are server farms in Western Australia that are doing just that now. So that, I think, is really interesting and has come out of, I think, Australia's emphasis on the importance of the environment and on the importance of thinking about the ecological consequences of what we do, including our digital memories. These digital memories then also have a particular consequence in terms of their impact on particularly Indigenous communities. And in the work that we've done, we can see connections between the impact on Indigenous communities in Australia in terms of mining and Indigenous communities here. The image is actually in Silicon Valley. This image is of a silicon mine, and it's interesting that Silicon Valley became named that. It used to be called the Valley of the Heart's Desire. And actually was, of course, in and of itself, that which had colonised an earlier community of Ohlone people, and that sites such as that silicon mining site have destroyed many ancient burial sites and sacred places. And again, you see this friction that has occurred in the technological production of what we can call our electronic goods and digital memories. What's also interesting then is that this is erased from corporate and public memory of events. So the Intel Museum on the western coast of the US actually doesn't include any reference to the Ohlone people or the impact of silicon mining on those particular communities. Now, this particular table here, for those of you who did chemistry, I don't know how many people did, and can remember what this bit down the bottom is, these are the rare earths, which are now much more important than silicon in terms of powering your laptop, your iPad, and the various things that we need in order to reduce and speed up, reduce the size of memory and speed it up. This is an image of a rare earth mining site, and in some ways it's very beautiful, you know, but it's changed the landscape irrevocably. It's changed it in a way that in many parts of Australia, despite legislation, is having an impact on Indigenous rock art sites, so images like the one that we saw at the beginning. So there's a kind of friction trade-off here in terms of we're mining stuff in order to make our digital memories quicker, faster, cheaper, and at the same time we're destroying some of the oldest memories on our planet. The materials from that particular mining site are then processed fairly near to Laverton in Western Australia, where it's mined near Mount Veld. But interestingly then, the Australian government didn't want a processing site within Australia itself. So the rare earths are then taken to Fremantle and shipped to Malaysia, to a different kind of economic zone, a free economic zone, which is not subject to the usual kind of restrictions in terms of pollution and environment and so on. So it's at that point that the rare earths then go to a particular site, which is the largest processing site for rare earths in the world, in Penang, in Malaysia. And it's that's then causing this particular point of friction that we saw at the beginning, with protesters who are working in Malaysia, but also then lobbying back in Australia this particular company, Linus, and saying, please, can you think about what you're doing in terms of actually dumping rare earths on this local environment in Penang. And what the local inhabitants fear, according to the interviews that we did, is they fear that the radioactivity will cause genetic damage to their children, that it will cause damage to fishing stocks, and they're dependent on fishing for a livelihood, and that the environmental report that the company had to produce before it went into operation doesn't clearly say what it will do with these radioactive materials. They also had great trouble in getting hold of this report. There were only 2 copies, and Linus itself banned them from using any digital media when they went in to look at the records. They weren't allowed to take photographs, and they weren't allowed to video. So do you know what the people did? This is amazing. 30 of them got together with notepads and pencils. They created a rota. They each went in for an hour and wrote down as quickly as they could the report. And then they got the whole report, and then they word processed it, and it's now on the internet. So, I mean, this is really interesting in terms of the kind of convolutions, if you like, of digital memory. I'm going to wind up soon. So these are some of the protesters that we interviewed, and it's also, it's really just to say that when we think about digital memory, we need to think about the trajectories that come out of a particular place in terms of its materialities. And in this instance, rare earths largely come out of China, and the mining site that we're looking at in Australia is one of the first in that region outside of China. So it's really interesting then to trace the particular trajectories and how it goes into our digital memory goods. So I just want to end really with this, which is this paper is from a published paper that's just come out called Seeing Red. And it's just to say to us as academics, whether we're in Australian studies or cultural memory studies as I am, that we are now part of this globital memory, this mix of digitisation and globalisation. And I've said here that I feel that I'm held at the end of a chain. I no longer walk to libraries to read books. By magic, they come to me. But this new magic is ancient, for memory produced under the interconnected conditions of globalisation and digitisation is in part mineral memory, and it comes from the core of the earth, not from the clouds. I'm seeing red on my screen, knowing that my digitally remembered red rock painting is far, far from green. Thank you.
Hello. No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. I feel a little bit like I'm kind of here under false pretenses, really. I'm kind of from the Copenhagen contingent, and I'm only going to speak fairly briefly, and it's because we're interested in Caribbean-Australian relationship. And so I'm going to talk to you briefly about a project which is in its very early stages, that is bringing Caribbean, Australian, but also much more broadly, this relationship which Anna has just raised about the very interesting, intimate, tangled relationship between culture and nature. When Anna was just talking about the words we use, cloud and farming, etc. We're quite fascinated by that, and having a look at the way literature is, I guess, in some ways a mirror, but a very interestingly complex kind of mirror of that relationship. And so I'm particularly interested in that. The people involved in the project are Russell McDougall, Sue Thomas and myself, and it grew out of our love of Caribbean literature. And we attend a biennial conference of Caribbean studies in Australia, and as you might imagine, it's a very small group of people, and a number of those people involved are, I guess, part of a Caribbean diaspora. There aren't many how would you say it? I'm not sure, West Indians, I guess, in Australia, so it's quite a small group. And cyclone, typhoon, hurricane, whatever you want to call it, is clearly a force of great impact in the Caribbean and has impacted enormously on the literature of the Caribbean. But of course, there's very close relationship in Australia. And so we started with this idea of the Caribbean, and we've moved it towards looking also at Australia, and then, as I said, shifting it out into the Pacific and further afield. Now, the reason why I feel like I'm a bit of a fraud in relation to this is because my part at the moment has concentrated on the Caribbean. I haven't actually got to the Australian part. We have a research assistant who's doing a lot of work to unearth literature that does reference or speak to hurricane, but it's in its very beginning stages. My particular interest, and I thought perhaps I could talk to that even though it's not about Australia, it's at the, as I said at the moment, situated in the Caribbean, is to have a look at the difference between the kind of language that is used, for example, by science and the kind of language that is used by poetry, and to look at its affect and its effect. And in order to do that, I thought I'd read you just a little so that you can recognise the kind of work that I'm interested in, and perhaps you could, in discussion time, maybe even come up with some kind of examples from Australian literature that might actually be correspond to this. A lot of work has been done, for example, on Capricornia. Alexis Wright's Capricornia, particularly with it in its relationship to cyclone. So I'm just going to read this to give you a sense of, as I said, the work I'm interested. The work, and not in a utilitarian sense really, but the work that poetry can do. The early morning of September the 12th was quiet, unusually quiet. Birds were seen heading west. By 9 a.m, Gilbert had made landfall on Jamaica's eastern tip, and packing winds of 175 miles per hour, the Category 5 hurricane cut a swathe of destruction across the 40-mile wide strip of the island. 80% of homes either suffered damage to or lost their roofs. Nearly every home lost electricity. 500,000 of the country's 2 million inhabitants were made homeless. 200 people lost their lives. Countless others suffered injury or illness due to contamination of the water supply and inadequate waste disposal, according to objective reports of the event. Now, what I want to do is just kind of read you the objective report and then read you a poem so you can see the difference. Hurricane Gilbert produced a 19-foot storm surge and brought up to 823 millimetres of rain in the mountainous areas of Jamaica, causing inland flash flooding. Prime Minister Edward Seaga stated that the hardest hit areas near where Gilbert made landfall looked like Hiroshima after the atom bomb. Estimated property damage reached more than 200 million. More than 100,000 houses were destroyed or damaged, and the country's banana crop was largely destroyed. Hundreds of miles of roads and highways were also heavily damaged. No planes were going in and out of Kingston, and telephone lines were jammed from Jamaica to Florida. The poultry industry was also wiped out. The damage from agricultural loss reached 500 million. All right, so that's the objective report, which ends with the observation that Hurricane Gilbert was the most destructive storm in the history of Jamaica and the most severe storm since Hurricane Charlie in 1951. Now, one of the things that I want to do in this project is to think about the way that poetry, and in this particular example I'm giving you Olive Senior's poetry, tells a story. The way poetry conveys the losses suffered somewhat differently to a report such as the one that I've just read, in which we are asked to understand the impact of the hurricane in terms of numbers and dollars. 5.8 metres of storm surge, 823 millimetres of rain, 100,000 homes destroyed, $200 million worth of property damage, $500 million worth of agricultural damage. Numbers that, as though in some kind of bizarre competition, tell us that Gilbert was a bigger man than Charlie. Or as Kingston resident Sita Nembard, a survivor of both hurricanes, remarked, "Well, me did think Charlie did bad, but after yesterday, Charlie a boyo." Right, so now I'm just going to move on to read you Olive Senior's telling of the story. So the poem is titled Hurricane Story 1988. And I want you to remember from the report a few things and see how they're reflected on in the poem. There was a lot of rain. Many people literally lost the roofs over their heads, and there were no flights coming in or out of Kingston. Okay. My mother wasn't christened Imelda, but she stashed a cache of shoes beneath the bed. She used to travel to Haiti, Panama, Curacao, Miami, wherever there was a bargain to catch, even shoes that didn't have match. Back home, she could always find customer, come bend down to look and talk where she planned herself on sidewalk. When the hurricane hit, she belly and ball, for 5 flights a day to Miami, grounded. No sail and her shoes getting jungo from the damp, since the roof decamp, and the rest sitting in customs impounded. My mother banked between her breasts, lived out her dreams in a spiff or two each night. Since the storm, things so tight, her breasts shrivel, the notes shrinking. Every night she there thinking. Every morning she get up and she wail, Lord, life so soak up and no bailout. To ratted. Okay, so what we see here is that Senior's poetry tells the personal stories of hurricane devastation, most often from the perspective of poor women's lives, and always with an eye for idiosyncrasy and humour. The statistics of millimetres of rainfall, of 100-mile-per-hour winds, are literally and literarily brought home, as are the small but significant consequences of the non-operation of flights between Jamaica and Miami. Yes, this is about economic devastation on a huge scale, the loss of billions of dollars, but that ruin is felt at the individual and the very personal level. The story of my mother, the seller of shoes, is the story of life on the street, the small businesswoman whose bank is her breasts. The consequence of the loss of income can be directly measured in her breast size, for as they shrivel from starvation, so too does the money fall away. An unusual form of econometrics, it has to be said. In Senior stories, there is no utter devastation, and there is in fact no tragedy. People suffer, people grieve, people crack up, and people survive. Even the dead survive in the stories told about them. They live on in the heart and the art of a community. And as with the very best of art, the particular takes on the universal significance. Life so soak up and no bailout. Now, ain't that the truth? So, this gives you a bit of an example of the kind of work that I am interested in pursuing in setting up this relationship between what poetry can do, how it does turn something, if you like, that's seen in terms of numbers into something much more personal, into something that mines nature in many ways to actually speak to the impact of nature. And I guess this is the project which we're at the very beginnings of. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we're doing. And I guess it also comes out of our interest that began in post-colonial studies, but a sense that post-colonial studies needs to move into this environmental studies, into eco-literary studies, and how we might productively take that somewhere. And it also comes out of, I guess, our interest in working across literatures, working into, I guess, what's being called today world literatures, to compare, to contrast, to see where the similarities and the differences might lie. So, I'll leave that there.
I'd like to talk about both the mobilisations of memory and the loss of livelihood, but in a different context. I want to talk about Europe, because the question has been asked earlier today, where is Europe in all this? Although I want to come at Europe from a very oblique angle. The session has the somewhat elongated theme of eco-comparative futures, so I thought I might say something about economic history, to extend the eco even further. Yes, it's economics, folks, so it's time to race for the exits. Economics generally is not a discipline that we normally associate with Australian studies, where the expertise, as we know, has tended to be drawn from history, literature, politics, sociology, and so forth. But I thought I might say something about the relevance and potential uses of economic history for Australian studies, and at the same time make a pitch for comparative methodologies, which is the other side of the session's remit. And in order to narrow it down to 20 minutes, I'm going to do the narcissist and take my point of departure in my own work. Coming back to the Menzies Centre after some 14 years casts my mind back to my own first book, Australia and the British Embrace, which came out just as I arrived here in 2001. Now, I don't expect that everyone in this room has avidly devoured the contents of that book, so just to bring us all onto the same page, it was a book about how Britain's path to membership of Europe, of the European Economic Community in the 1960s and 70s, upended a whole host of assumptions about Australia's inherent or natural place within an imperial economic orbit. Amid a whole lot of admittedly dry detail in that book about butter exports, wheat quotas, imperial tariff preferences, the sliding levies of the Common Agricultural Policy, and so on, I was trying to show how Britain joining Europe brought about some fundamental alterations to the language, the assumptions, the outlook, and if you like, the global orientation of Australian political culture. So to my mind, it was a book about Australia's economic pathway to post-colonialism. Now, this was a book that was written in the 1990s, and needless to say, I'd go about it differently if I were to start that project from scratch today. The 1990s, as we've heard earlier today, was the era of the consolidation of national identity as the key intellectual pursuit of Australian studies, and area studies perhaps more generally. And so it's unsurprising that this book was fundamentally concerned with the problem of nationhood, with nation states as the core units of analysis, national archives as the main source material, and so on. And I think also importantly, and what we haven't talked about, is that the publishing context at that time also insisted that it be thus. I did actually want to include some material in that book about some of the wider concerns of other colonial and Commonwealth contexts, if only to show that there was more to this story than Britain and Australia. But I was given very clearly to understand that there was not more to this than Britain and Australia, at least if I wanted an Australian publisher. Such was the publisher's insistence that the European underlined, economic underlined community didn't even get a mention in the title, even though economics and Europe were the elemental load in the story. They got ruled out of the title, but they did get a mention in the blurb. Anyway, I went along happily with all this. I'm not pretending that, I'm some kind of futuristic transnational visionary thwarted by the evil genius of my publisher. But the point is to show how work is also the product of its publishing context. But as with any research undertaking, the minute that you apply any kind of prism or frame of reference, you tend to screen out other vistas, other interpretive possibilities. And looking back on the subject matter of that book, I see two potential avenues for renewing that story to chime in with some of the more contemporary issues that we've been talking about this morning and this afternoon. The first would be a renewed attention to local and regional contexts. Viewed from Canberra, the impending disaster or imagined disaster of Britain joining Europe was understood at the macroeconomic level. About a third of Australia's national export income disappearing with the stroke of a pen. But at the regional level, particularly for communities throughout Australia that produce things like tin fruit, wheat, butter, dairy goods in general, the loss of the British market was a matter of far greater urgency, posing for some communities the threat of complete economic annihilation. These were, after all, settler colonial industries that had been developed to feed a far bigger market than Australia, safe in the assumption that Britain would always want their surplus produce, which in some cases amounted to upwards of 70 or 80% of their total production. So to isolate in order to isolate just one example of these regional dynamics and to illustrate their potential, I want to say something about the sugar industry in North Queensland, which had grown enormously in the 20th century on the back of exports to Britain via the imperial tariff preference system. But before doing so, I want to take this local perspective and connect up with another prism that I think was missing in my original story, namely the wider global repercussions of British entry into the EEC, arguably one of the biggest, almost fundamental changes to the way in which goods are traded in the world in the 20th century. And this is where the Caribbean comparison comes in, because here we can start to join up the otherwise scattered story of Britain turning away from imperial cane sugar and opting for subsidised beet sugar, available in abundance in Western Europe. Eric Williams of Trinidad once famously referred to this as the war of the two sugars, beet and cane. But it was also a struggle between an older imperial pattern of world trade that was rapidly being phased out by a new era of European protectionism designed to keep produce from new world suppliers from undercutting the livelihood of European farmers. Now, to narrow it down further, if we take two regions, far north Queensland, and of course those of you who know me will know this is all close to my heart, so the sugar belt from roughly Mackay northwards to Mosman on the one hand, and the island of Barbados on the other. Here we start to see all kinds of interesting perspectives emerging. These regions were not only monocultures, as the economists term them, that is to say, entire communities that are really dependent for their external livelihood on a single crop, but they were also set up as monocultures, producing far more sugar than they could ever possibly consume themselves, no matter how sweet the tooth might become, in order to feed the ever-sweetening tastes of consumers elsewhere. Sugar, of course, is the original empire commodity that from the 17th century enslaved countless millions of Africans, and so its demise, I think, as a unit of colonial exchange in the 20th century is, I think, a really interesting barometer of global decolonisation, or a different way, if you like, of telling that story. Now, to be sure, North Queensland is not Barbados. I get that. Barbados, where sugar was grown for 2 centuries before it was first successfully grown in Queensland in the 1860s. So I need not elaborate on the obvious geographic, demographic and historical differences, but examining the ways in which the socio-economic histories of these regions became caught up in the same global dynamics need not and should not be about emphasising similarities over differences. But in the very little time that I have, I want to sketch the possibilities and the implications of placing these regional contexts in the same frame. First interesting thing to note is that the first sugar in Queensland was produced with the assistance of a recent immigrant by the name of John Buett from, you guessed it, Barbados. There'd been earlier failed attempts to grow sugar, but it really took someone from a plantation colony, rather than Britain, to recognise Queensland's suitability in terms of soil, climate, but more importantly to provide the necessary technical know-how for an agricultural sector that requires an unusual high degree of technical expertise. And it was on that same Ormiston plantation in the 1860s that the first Melanesian indentured labourers were imported to Queensland. Again, no surprises for guessing where that idea came from. The sugar industry in both regions produced societies that were organised around acute racial distinctions and hierarchies, partly due to the labour-intensive nature of sugar cultivation and partly due to all kinds of hoary assumptions about Europeans not being racially suited to hard physical work in the tropics, far better suited to management and so forth. Thirdly, because so much of the sugar crop was for so long destined for elsewhere, certain ideas about community, place and belonging became interwoven with these naturalised economic frameworks. To take just the most superficial example of the streetscape, in the centre of Barbados, you have the main square, which was once known as, for many centuries, known as Trafalgar Square, with its own statue of Lord Nelson. It's been latterly renamed National Hero Square. In Queensland, you don't have a statue of Lord Nelson, but the central traffic grid of Mackay runs from north to south, Victoria, Alfred, Gordon and Shakespeare, and then when we move from east to west, we have Milton, Peel, Wellington and Nelson. Someone ought to get them a statue, perhaps. It might be an improvement on the statue of the giant cane toad that they have up the road in Serena. The term Little England was frequently associated with Barbados from the early 19th century and was fully embraced by the white oligarchy who retained firm control over the sugar industry right down to the 1960s. In Queensland, you had a somewhat different emphasis into the 20th century, when Melanesian labour was expelled as part of the contract of the Compact of Federation, the White Australia policy and so forth. From then on, North Queenslanders made much of the fact that theirs was white sugar, meaning, of course, produced by white labour. And they clearly expected that this entitled them to special favours in the British market. And just to give you one example, in Mackay in 1927, a visit from Colonial Secretary Leo Amery led to the Queensland Cane Growers Council producing a commemorative booklet. And we're very happy to have the Colonial Secretary come and visit. We've summed up the position as follows, and this is really the only source I'm going to bring into this. The sugar industry in Queensland provides a wonderful demonstration of the practicability of settling effectively tropical territory with a white, virile population. It is considered of superlative importance that Australia should forever remain a white man's country, and that the people to develop its resources should be of the British race. In Queensland, sugar is produced entirely by white labour that can outwork any non-British race in the sugar fields. The British gangs head the list for efficiency and economy of labour against all comers. And interestingly, after this passage, there's a little explanatory note, presumably for Leo Amery himself, where it says, the term British is used to cover all white British nationalities, whether born in Australia or Great Britain. Lest there be any confusion about that. The point I'm making is not, I think, in itself all that original, that commerce and commodities on the one hand, and ideas of community and networks of belonging on the other, became internalised and intermeshed in all sorts of complex ways. But I think this phenomenon has generally been looked at in isolation from the wider networks that the goods themselves traversed. With a case like sugar, you have vastly different production contexts that produce strikingly similar, but by no means identical, cultural outcomes. In the case of tropical Queensland and Barbados, we have the possibility of exploring variations on how a colonial culture worked to naturalise a colonial economy, and vice versa. Now, although there have been many studies of empire commodities and how goods became conveyors of imperial taste and so forth, work on tea, sugar and so forth, there's almost nothing to my knowledge on how these dynamics were played out with the collapse of empire trading networks after the Second World War. Which brings me finally, yes, and I do have time, back to Britain's quite sudden decision to join the European community in the early 1960s. And I distinguish between the sudden decision and the sudden achievement of that ambition, which took 10 years and 2 vetoes by General de Gaulle to achieve. But in this period, in this decade, there are interesting patterns of response to Britain's European aspirations that speak, I think, to a common experience of the creeping economic obsolescence and hence cultural obsolescence of empire. Now, it's not a research paper, so I'll resist the temptation to rattle off a string of sources and will instead confine myself to 2 very basic observations. And the first one is this, that as it became increasingly clear that Britain's many promises and assurances that they would never become part of the European Economic Community without protecting the interests of Commonwealth sugar, as it became clear that these promises were not going to be kept, you start to see all kinds of belated appeals to an unrequited Britishness, berating a Britain that was not merely turning its back on its own colonial produce, but on its own people, on its own kind. Now, here it needs to be said that the common market problem became caught up in the new Commonwealth immigration restrictions that the Macmillan government also brought in 1962, and so these 2 issues were often mentioned in the same breath. Thus we have Grantley Adams, the Barbadian Labour leader and West Indies federal PM, declaring in London in 1961, "We are as British as a person from Somerset or Devon." A decade later, we have Queensland's Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen saying almost precisely the same thing about Queenslanders. Joe couldn't comprehend Britain's firm no. He actually said it in French, non, to Queensland sugar. An attitude that he said was just too European to be British. It is at variance with the voice of Britain that I've known for so long. Now this, of course, is from a man who spoke fluent Danish and whose subtly accented English was a field day for political impersonators and so forth. And then the second general observation is that alongside these appeals to a common British identity were invocations of the moral burden of empire, the mobilisation of memory that we heard about earlier, of debts incurred in the imperial past which Britain could not lightly contract out of. In the case of Queensland, and also in Australasia more generally. The recurring trope was the sacrifice of servicemen in two world wars to keep Britain safe from the very people whose beet sugar producers were now poised to take their markets. And this was repeatedly brought to the attention of people in this country. In Barbados, and again in the West Indies more generally, where you also had talk about the war sacrifice, here the moral debt was of course more clearly linked to the memory of slavery and became more explicitly spelt out the more Britain's determination to get into Europe come hell or high water became obvious. And what I find particularly interesting about these imperatives of memory is two things. Firstly, it was in the moment that they were articulated as grievance that they began to lose their rhetorical or emotional power. The fact that they needed to be mobilised in this way was in a sense a concession that this kind of way of thinking about the self and one's orientation in the world was already going through a process of reconsideration. So in other words, we shouldn't take these sources at their face value. And secondly, these grievances were articulated and activated as much in Britain. You had both the right wing of the Tory party, who wanted to uphold these older colonial links as essential to their own self-perception. So there's letters going to the Heath government from their own Tory backbenchers really asking the question, do we really want to ditch all of this sugar? But you also had left-wing humanitarian groups. You had the Movement for Colonial Freedom. You had people like Fenner Brockway, who vehemently opposed what they saw as the sellout of the livelihood of the West Indian Islands. But that I think is a further reason why our unit of study can and should usefully fan out from representations of national identity to embrace the wider circulations and interactions of memory, goods, culture, and networks of belonging in the late imperial world. These weren't confined to national context, but on the contrary only made sense to the extent that they resonated mutually across regional boundaries. Or to conclude, there's a lot more we can learn in the field of Australian studies. We'll learn a lot more about Australia by placing Australia at one remove from the centre frame. Thanks.
So we've been talking a lot today about the future of Australian studies and how it might benefit from a more transnational and a more interdisciplinary approach. And I'm not here to talk about the future, but to try and present a case of what that might look like. And as it's been said, we're quite a lot of people here from Copenhagen, and I think that in Copenhagen, coming from the outside as a non-English-speaking country, we have to look at English-speaking countries in a more transnational sense and in a more interdisciplinary sense, because we're looking at both literature, history, and language, and at all kinds of English-speaking countries around the world. So my project looks at autobiographies written at or after the end of the British Empire by people from around the globe writing about their lives before and during decolonization. I examine how these national and international changes affect them on a personal level, and so my project is sort of situated between history and literature, and also drawing on insights from psychology and sociology about the workings of memory. So in terms of Australian studies, I'm interested in how Australia sheds light on broader issues and a more universal problem about the memory of empire. As we will see in a few moments, looking at Australian autobiographies in comparison with texts from other parts of the globe reveals both their specificities but also striking and perhaps surprising similarities. In my dissertation, I look at a number of country texts, but in this case that I've brought with me today, I will examine two settings, Australia and the Caribbean. I will consider 4 autobiographies written by people who traveled to the imperial metropolis in their youth and then wrote about it years later. The Caribbean texts that I'm looking at are The Pleasures of Exile by George Lamming, partly about his journey to England a decade earlier. It's written in 1960, And then Jamaican psychologist Joyce Gladwell, who's not very well known, but in 1969 she wrote Brown Face, Big Master referring to God, which describes how she came to England in 1953 and settled there. From Australia, it's historian Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Solid Bluestone Foundations from 1983, about her 2-year study in England in the 1920s, and then Patrick White, who we've heard about quite a lot today. In 1981, he wrote Flaws in the Glass, which is part autobiography, part essays and travelogue. But the autobiography is about his various stays in England in the 1920s to 1940s, where he went both as a child to go to boarding school and then later to write and study. What will become apparent is that all 4 writers, in spite of their different origins, describe similar upbringings in an imperial mindset and partially similar experiences of alienation and a sense of exclusion, and how this led in different ways to new kinds of belonging. All 4 writers describe the idea of England as home or as culturally superior, and how that idea pervaded the societies in which they grew up, and they do so from a point in time when such notions have become discredited or are becoming discredited. Thus, Fitzpatrick distances herself from such admiration by ascribing to her mother the, quote, ambition to take her children home, to have their colonial rough edges filed and polished. And White attributes the decision to send him to a boarding school to, quote, a seed sown in a ambitious colonial mother's mind by the English head of a preparatory school in Australia, end quote. In a Caribbean context, Gladwell says that, quote, since my mind and imagination were fed on English scenes and English thoughts, it became imperative for me to go to England to bring to fulfillment these experiences which were begun at school, end quote. And finally, Lamming describes West Indian society as inimical to artistic ambition, as well as his own youthful desire to gain imperial sanction for his writing. Here we see the cultural cringe in action in both colonial contexts, and it's evident that the notion that Britain was at once superior to and a second home for colonial subjects, at least for middle-class colonials around the globe, was a motivating factor for the author's journeys to the metropolis. Yet their hopes are shown to be disappointed. When encountering the gaze of the British other, the writers describe feeling excluded from a community to which they thought that they belonged. When disappointed with English people's lack of curiosity about the empire and its inhabitants, Fitzpatrick says that she came to realize that, quote, English people had not been brought up in the kinship myth in which colonials of my generation had been nurtured. We were not their long-lost cousins, and they could not be expected to welcome and cherish us, end quote. It's clear that there's been a clash between expectations of recognition as fellow Britons and the experience of being viewed as an outsider. Instead, the authors describe being looked down upon as colonials. Thus, White describes, quote, those bitter days when I was a despised colonial, attempting to pass myself off as an English schoolboy, end quote. And Fitzpatrick says that, quote, in England we were not exactly foreigners, but decidedly we were not English either, but colonials, people of an inferior race, end quote. While Fitzpatrick resorts to the language of race to describe the lack of identification she encountered, for Lamming and Gladwell, feelings of exclusion are linked to experiences with English racism in a way that really does relate to skin color. Gladwell describes numerous instances of downright racism, and she tells us how it came to a shock to her to be considered as black because her relatively light skin had so far secured her a high status in Jamaica. She uses this shock to document both English racism, but also to expose her own youthful arrogance against darker people. Lamming uses his personal experience of differential treatment because of his color as a lens through which to criticize what he calls the English way of seeing. It's a hierarchical view formed by imperialism. While racism gives different inflections to Lemming and Gladwell's memories, they clearly share with Fitzpatrick and White this sense of alienation. As a reaction to this alienation, the writers describe the emergence of various kinds of other belonging. Belongings which reflect some of the central points of their individual autobiographical projects. Thus, Gladwell describes reconciling herself with God, and it's almost as if her strengthened faith enables her to overcome and maybe even forgive English racism. White, at least as contemptuous against Australians as towards the English, seems never to be at home in the societies in which he lives, even though he settles in and, as it were, settles for Australia. But he finds a home for two with his partner, Mannerly. Mannerly, he says, quote, became the central mandala in my life's hitherto messy design, end quote, suggesting that it's in this relationship rather than in any one country that he feels at home. Lemming argues that, quote, most West Indians of my generation were born in England, end quote, because, quote, no Barbadian, no Trinidadian, no St. Lucian, no islander from the West Indies sees himself as a West Indian until he encounters another islander in foreign territory. I think it's quite important here that England is for him now foreign territory. Thus, Lemming uses his individual experience of discovering the emergence of a pan-West Indian identity in the metropolis to support a political project of the West Indian Federation, which was struggling for its life at the time of writing. And finally, Fitzpatrick's autobiography can be read as a parallel coming-of-age story of herself and that of her country, and her journey leads to her own appreciation of the distinctiveness of Australia. For Fitzpatrick, a powerful turning point towards her independent Australian nationalism is when she is mistaken for an American, rather than recognized as a fellow imperial citizen. In her interview for a scholarship at the University of Cambridge, she's asked where she's done her bachelor's degree. And when she answers Melbourne, the female Don answers that Cambridge does not value American degrees highly. Quote, could a Cambridge Don be ignorant of the fact that Melbourne was one of the largest cities of her own British Empire? If she really thought I was American, why was she so rude? I would not have minded being mistaken for an American. I did not feel superior to the Americans, and at that moment I felt strongly on their side because I had just understood for the first time why they'd felt it necessary to cut the painter with home in 1776. End quote. The fact that the Don sees her as an American casts her outside of the imperial community to which she felt she belonged. This is a significant moment as it shows Fitzpatrick implicitly considering a similar Australian break with home as she felt strongly on their side. She remarks upon the Don's tone of superiority, which I was to come to know so well, indicating that this is not to be considered a unique event, but rather the first case of a later of what will subsequently become a familiar experience. This allows us to interpret the sudden sympathy with the American choice as the first case of a later standard response. And sure enough, Fitzpatrick ends her memoir along the Australian coast, seeing Fremantle and saying the words, I had been home and now was coming home. Here the inverted commas and a capital H for England stresses the illusory nature of England as home, and the lowercase h for Australia demonstrates its down-to-earth authenticity. By reading Australian autobiographies in comparison with life writing from other parts of the empire, such as the Caribbean, it becomes apparent that some of the issues that the authors are dealing with are spring from their imperial past rather than from their Australianness. Thus, it's apparent that while it may have been, I'll take some water. That while it may have taken different forms depending on their different contexts, the inculcation of the idea of Britain as culturally superior and the resultant cringing, if you were, and the desire to go to the imperial metropolis was not unique to Australia, but may be found in the Caribbean as well. Yet it's also clear that there are very real differences to the author's experiences, such as the experience of English racism, which is naturally, as we hear, an experience of the for our West Indian cases, but the Australian writers just describe the humiliation of not being recognized as fellow Briton. Common to the responses of these four authors is their sense of exclusion from British society and the turn to another kind of belonging. But this also differs widely, reflecting not only their different contexts, but also their individual personal messages with their autobiographies. Thus, Gladwell's turn to God matches the trajectory of her entire autobiography, which is a spiritual search. Lamming's discovery of a pan-West Indian community is in line with his many exhortations for West Indians to stand together and throw up the yoke of British imperialism. White's community for two is part of both his hagiography of his partner and his rejection of the rest of the world. And Fitzpatrick's parallel story of her own maturity and independent self-awareness and that of her country strengthens her self-portrayal as a national historian. End of Empire autobiographies then reflect simultaneously deeply personal issues and larger societal developments, and may improve our understanding of how the dissolution of British imperial ties has been experienced and recalled differently or similarly across the empire. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and 4 brilliant papers which I'm sure have sparked a lot of comments, a lot of synapses. So over to you.
While Anne was talking, I was desperately trying to think of Australian examples, which no doubt you're doing too.
Yes.
But are there any? I mean, the only one I could think of was not a poem, but I recently read a book called Piano Lessons by, well, you know, I can't remember who, but just my memory. Her father's an Adelaide poet. But it's set in Darwin, part of it's set in Darwin. You read it?
No.
Part of it's set in Darwin during the cyclone.
Okay.
It's quite fascinating, that part of it.
So what a lot of the work in the archives is revealing is a lot of 19th century poetry, stories coming out of newspapers, that kind of thing, that we can probably usefully mine. But yeah, it's just an interesting project, as I said, and my 2 colleagues have done more on the Australian side of things. But it's really a matter of finding what's there. If you think about the huge impact that cyclone has in Australia, it would be surprising to discover that there was nothing. The fact that we're not familiar with is an interesting thing to think about. Why not? But I'd be surprised if there wasn't. And if there isn't, then there's something to be said about that. Something that has such huge impact.
Yes. If there is, I would think of this because of the time, so the sort of regional differentiation in Australian culture, actually. And cyclones don't happen in Sydney.
That's right, tropical cyclone, yeah. So, yeah, we're just at the beginning, and it's interesting to see what we will and won't discover, yeah.
Did you want to
Go ahead.
The business of comparison is always a difficult one because, of course, one has a set of metrics which you understand very clearly, and then one reaches towards another set with which you seek to set up some kind of comparison. So I hate to take on the role of the native informant, but I'd like to sort of briefly comment on all 3 of those papers, in which at least from coming from a kind of Caribbeanist side, I think there's a little bit of asymmetry which hasn't yet been worked out yet in terms of those comparisons. I mean, first of all, starting out with hurricanes versus cyclones, I mean, the fundamental difference is the hurricane in the context of the Caribbean is simply an extreme form of what is the key geographical feature which creates the Caribbean historically, at least within the European context, which is the northeast trade winds. So the thing about the hurricane is it's actually, in other words, something which has a particular kind of nightmare relationship to something which is formative and fundamental. And so I think I think there's a difference there, which can be explored. I can't think of any Australian comparisons, not knowing very much Australian literature, but I think there's you could obviously, Andrew Salkey has a children's novel, Hurricane. It's worth looking at. So there's Kamal Rathod has a poem on hurricane where he says, how do we take the hurricane and the wind and use it to create a different kind of verse scansion. So anyway, hurricanes versus cyclones. Sugar, okay, once again, in a way it's a very similar sort of point, that the place of sugar in the context of the West Indies, particularly in the context of Barbados, is just qualitatively so different. And it's not just different in terms of having, a kind of multi-century kind of landscape-creating, society-creating role, but in the very specific context of the 20th century, the sugar industry becomes part of a specific collaboration between the British colonial state and these societies in the wake of the labour rebellions of the 1930s. And that the role of colonial development and welfare in building central factories and in investing in a different scale of sugar production, particularly in Barbados, which had a very kind of small-scale sugar industry in the early, gives the relationship with the imperial power and over the sugar preference question a different freight. Add to that, too, that even in the wake of the European community, precisely because France has significant interests in its former colonies in terms of trading partners, there are very quickly, particularly by the 1970s, a set of agreements negotiated via particularly the Lomé Convention is the mature form, 1975, which created a kind of continuation of the structures of imperial trade under another rubric, only eventually to be disrupted in the neoliberal moment in the 1990s by the WTO. So there's also much more continuity in the preferential access to the European market in the context of the Caribbean than there is in the case of Australian sugar. So again, there's a slight sort of difference there. And I hope you don't think this is too petty, but I suppose one becomes, when one thinks from one side, one can be more sensitive to asymmetry in comparison. And finally, in terms of thinking about the final paper, the Lamming paper, I think that Lamming text is one I know reasonably well. And I suppose I read it slightly differently, to the extent that Lamming's point is not that he goes to the empire seeking its validation, but that the predicament of the colonial condition was such that the only way in which one could hope to become a writer and to be paid for one's work and to be published and to actually break through the gap from writing short stories in the back of your exercise book into actually being published was by making that gap. Now that's, again, qualitatively different from the situation of your Australian writers, where there's quite a healthy publishing industry in the big cities of Australia by the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, this is sorry to have cavilled in this way, but I think the enterprise is a rich one, but yes, to be done with some caution.
Mine's for Astrid, really, and I wondered, the way I read your reading of the two Australian autobiographies there was a kind of realist reading. So in other words, you're looking at you're treating them as almost a descriptive of a particular engagement in that earlier period, the 20s, 30s, and so on. But I wondered about the post-imperial aspect and the way memory is operating here. And I guess I know more about White than about Fitzpatrick. And I mean, White had a roaring time in Britain in the 1930s, for example, not least because it was possible to be a cultured homosexual man here in a way that it wasn't in Sydney in the same period, and for a whole range of other reasons too. But I'm wondering about whether these autobiographies are operating almost as kind of, parables or something of a post-imperial condition, I guess. So to what extent do we read them as experiential, in other words, descriptive of a particular engagement experience? To what extent do we have to take account of the ways in which memory is, if you like, renovating that experience in light of the fact that they're both writing in the 1980s in essentially a post-imperial Australia. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll start with your point, Frank. Within 15 minutes, there's only so much you can do. And the article that this springs from deals very much with how memory and the time of writing is affecting what they're writing about. And I think it's interesting that what does shine through Patrick White's memoir is that he did have a roaring time, but at the same time he's also anxious to position himself as at one remove from that enjoyment, in a sense. So when he describes going to this lunch with the Queen when she was visiting Australia, he says that, and then he came back and he threw off all his snaring clothes and he cooked dinner for his husband, who was so much more distinguished than many of the guests that he's just attended and so forth. So he's obviously trying to negotiate that position and not least the audience that he's writing to. I think that while giving Australians a hard time, he's also speaking to the Australian audience. So I think memory is very much at work here, and the same thing goes for Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who was so anxious to distance herself from that imperial dream, which she actually did share with her mother before going. And the question is whether it was really the moment of travel which made the final cut for them, or whether it was a hurtful experience, perhaps in some ways, which is then translated into this cutting the painter with home when writing in '83, for instance.
See, I mean, White has reconstructed or rebuilt himself, if you like, by the early 80s as Republican, anti-nuclear, Labour voting, and all the rest of it. We know that he was a Menzies supporter, for example, in the 1950s. So I wonder about that reconstructing itself in the context of it.
And thank you for that point, Richard. And I think you're definitely right that what he's really criticising is that that imperial propaganda, which makes it even makes for West Indians to not want to throw off the yoke, that he's sort of trying to encourage an atmosphere of rejection and realization that we're being suppressed, and why can these African people claim their independence, why won't we even try, and so forth. But I think that he's also trying to locate with his younger self a belief in that he says that he did desire the imperial sanction of his work, but now he's somehow achieved an enlightened status where that's not what he's seeking anymore.
Quite really exactly those words that
Thanks, Richard. All good comments and great to have them. Not least because you probably don't know this, but what set this hair running was some comments you made on my inaugural lecture a few years ago, so you're partly to blame. I agree, it would come as no surprise to anyone in this room that I know more about Queensland than Barbados. But in all seriousness, I think it's important to underline that I'm not trying to posit some broad equivalence. It's quite evident that the historical and cultural position or place of sugar in Barbados is of an entirely different order of magnitude than it is in Queensland. But what happens in the 1960s is that these two different narratives are brought into the same room, quite literally, in terms of all the negotiations and the haggling and so forth that goes on. And so in that sense, I think that I think there is a useful enterprise here to try and trace out the ways in which this problem, this common problem, resonates in multiple different contexts, but in, I think, still strikingly, with some strikingly similar resonances. Lome, I think you're way too kind to the French and what happens in 1974-75. It is true, I mean, I didn't get the chance to finish this story, but it's quite an interesting sort of denouement, if you like, particularly for Queensland, Because what turns out is of all these sugar producers having been promised by Britain that we'll look after you, and because it's not just West Indies and Australia, you've got Fiji, you've got Mauritius, you've got not Natal anymore because they left the Commonwealth and so they were no longer included. But what happens is Britain eventually is able to get the Europeans to agree to look after these developing countries, and everyone is allowed in the room except Queensland. And so this is a hugely traumatic moment in far north Queensland, that to find themselves, who they consider, with all this talk about white sugar and British sugar and our sugar, surely we should be first rather than last. But that's actually how it transpires. But even the West Indians are ultimately double-crossed. That they're promised with this ridiculous sort of vague formula that they're going to be looked after, and it's only after Britain is in that the Lomé Conventions are renegotiated. Barbados ends up with a quota that's a third of what it was getting under the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement. It's getting 50,000 tonnes of sugar in under Lomé. It's nothing. It's not going to keep the sugar industry afloat. The other problem you have with sugar is that the uncertainty sugar needs, because of the high degree of technical know-how and the long frame in terms of investment capital, all the sugar growers in the West Indies, particularly in Jamaica, are screaming out for investment capital by 1968, 69, 70, because the word is that Britain's going in and no one knows what that's going to imply. So already they're struggling to look ahead. So acreage is actually already declining even before Britain goes in, because there is simply not enough investment capital. Jamaica turns to Heath for a state loan in 1971 because they can't raise capital privately. So if you look at sugar in the long run, yes, it's true that other factors do play into it. The fact that the sale of sugar is taken off the pound and anchored, the price is pitched in ECUs, European currency units, and these are nowhere near as good as sterling, particularly when your own currency is pegged to the dollar. By the mid-1980s, Barbados sugar is finished.
But it was finished because it was replaced by tourism progressively from the 60s onwards.
Well, tourism replaces sugar as the leading source of external income in the early 70s, but that's not the reason why sugar is finished. The two could easily have continued if the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement.
That's the other problem. So from the 70s, they were trying to put in mechanical harvesters because the labour cost was too high, and it's very successful trade union. So there's the comparisons with Guyana, where sugar continues to be produced profitably, but Barbados was already on the way up.
Yeah.
Yeah, just briefly, to talk to Richard's point, I think what this kind of comparative work does, and I'm very aware of the dangers of it, is that what I'm interested in is this entangled relationship between geographies and histories, and they're not going to be the same in each place. But I think the other thing is when you raise Brathwaite, you're talking, Brathwaite says the pentameter does not roar in hurricane, the hurricane doesn't roar in pentameters. But what he's doing is talking about the difficulty of when you've got a transplanted culture, then the relationship between the geography and the culture then gets, what's the word I want? It somehow gets destroyed in some way, and so it's about trying to work towards a means of bringing that geography more closely in alignment with the culture. And I guess what I'm interested in is seeing how and where that happens in Australia as well, because you have a similar cultural overlay. And because poetry works with these long cultural traditions, and we're talking about English, I was really interested in our aspect of talking about language as part of that history and that geography that is important. They're the things I'm interested in. So I guess that kind of work actually points up the interesting differences, but also those larger theoretical relationships between geographies and histories and culture, which is so interesting.
Can I just add as well? I mean, I think what really struck me about our four papers actually is the significance of memory. We were kind of asked to talk about ecology and eco-criticism, but what's interesting is that memory keeps coming up, and that we're seeking to find a way to analyse that across cultures comparatively in your cases. And in my case, what I'm suggesting is that we think about this in terms of what Michael Rothberg would say is multi-directionality and multi-trajectory, And you could see that actually in terms of the guy who comes over with the knowledge to plant sugar, that actually he comes from the Caribbean. And so it's about these connections and connectivities and trajectories, it seems to me, that is useful conceptually within any kind of comparison studies or comparative studies, which is not something I do, but within memory studies you look at these trajectories and you look at the ways in which things are mobilised and travel, rather than seeking to sort of fix maybe two nations looking at each other in a particular way. So just to add that.
I'll try and be quick, but on the cyclone literature, I'm sure theoretically, short stories, and Andrew McGann's 1988, which is not really about cyclones, although it's about weather, and these two, it's a fantastically, it's a hilarious satirical novel about these two guys who go up to the, the Northern Territory, and they are weather watchers, but it's actually about the sham of the bicentenary and all of that. But it sort of is about
But the
cyclones
historical
and-
geographic are together there, so that's
yeah. And Stuart, I'm sure there's a discussion to be had about, that quintessential Australian play of the mid-century, summer of the 17th doll, the cane cutters. So Lawler, I think, was onto the problem. But that's
that's good.
That's serious, actually.
And that's actually up. Yeah, it's a
When is the
serious
play from again?
5.
55, around there.
5, yeah. I think, anyway, it's all about emasculation and urbanism and change in Australia.
Yeah, well, I think that play is as much about the mechanisation of the sugar industry, because the Queensland industry very early on is a sort of leader in getting labour, putting labour out of work and putting machines in as well. So perhaps as much about that as it is about sort of markets disappearing in this, that, or the other part of the world. But but the image of the cane cutter, you go up and down the Queensland coast, and there's statues of cane cutters in Mackay and Innisfail, and interestingly in Mackay they have a statue of a white cane cutter. And then a few years, actually no, first they put up a statue for a Melanesian cane cutter, so it was remembering indentured labour and so forth. And then I'm not sure what the relation is between the two statues, about 5 years later they put up a statue for a white cane cutter. Almost exactly the same statue actually, it's different parts of town. And one of the things that got me thinking about this whole question is that my brother and sister live in a part of Queensland called Cutters Ridge, which is sort of a new estate that has been set up, and it has a little statue of a cane cutter as you go in. But it's become a housing estate because they no longer grow sugar there. So it's sort of in itself a memorial to the different uses, the subdivisions and so forth that went on for all this land can no longer be put to use.
I just want to say that we weren't suggesting that the play could be used simply as an illustration.
No.
We were saying actually that your research could be deployed usefully to illuminate the play, which I think it very much could do actually as a kind of widening framework to approach work of literature like that. And it's as Australian literature to actually show how it's saying something which is another way.
There is. So we still have a couple of minutes. So, do you want the microphone, or are you good to project?
I can speak, but Anna's paper, you made one point that digital memory is therefore in the process of destroying mineral memory. And I was thinking that memory or representation, and from your beautiful presentation, representation is always destroying something. And there was one people, have we got the figures? I thought it was absolutely fascinating.
sense, I'm not sure that's the overall point I'm making, which is that it's worse or better, but that actually there's a continuity that we ignore when we buy into the simple rhetoric that the cloud is cheap, clean and abundant, and that all we have to do is digitise everything from medieval manuscripts to rock art and we'll be sorted. And my point is really that there's continuities with, as you suggest actually, earlier forms of mediated memory and representation that all in a sense have a cost. If you think about the Maxwell and Miller's talk about the laying of the transatlantic cables, which resulted in the felling of hundreds of thousands of petrocucha trees in order to create the rubber to cover the cables. So, and that's an earlier technology, and in a sense each new technology has a cost, but that what capitalism tends to do is to cover up that cost, so that we think that it's the next best thing that we should do and have in terms of moving on to better forms of representation. But it's inflected and it's dialectical, it seems to me. Just as the protesters themselves showed, they can digitally witness, which is great, and take their protest from local Malaysia to the UK to Australia, but actually it's inflected with the cost that they're protesting against. And I think it's just to alert people to that, to the materialism of what we often think of as virtual memory and some of its roots which lie in Australia.
And our final question.
Okay. It was a suggestion to Anne, following what Anne said about using, I wondered if you thought about looking at literatures that would reveal the impact of those hurricanes and cyclones. I'm thinking particularly as we were talking about one of the most highly cultivated products in the world, about, and partly because I've done some of this myself, looking at the literatures of cultivation, of planting and cultivation, what happens when that goes wrong, when there is a hailstorm and you lose all your crops and all the rest of it. And that's certainly written about in some life writing, in accounts of settlers in Australia and in more reflective, but it's also there in professional journals. So it's just a
wider literature.
Okay, thank you.
At that point, I think we'll be able to wrap up. Take a break. Can you join me in thanking
I'm pushing us on because I would like us to be able to have a reasonable amount of time to wrap up. I don't think we should feel obliged that we have to wrap this up because it's an ongoing conversation. I'm certainly going to be taking away an enormous amount of ideas to think about and think through with you, actually, I hope, as we continue to think about what a Menzies Centre might be, but also, of course, much more broadly and more interestingly, in a way, what Australian studies might be. Just a reminder that after this session finishes by at least 5:45, you have half an hour to get yourselves beautiful and across the road. And I think I'm led to believe the doors will open about 6:15 at Australia House, and to remind you that we will be starting speeches promptly at 7:15. So if you want to get there in time, get your drink to endure the speeches. They'll be pretty quick, I hope. Or they'll be wonderful, actually, I'm sure. A quick note also that I've co-opted Stuart at the last minute to also join this panel. He's not trying to take over every single panel that we've had today. We had somebody represented from Copenhagen who in the end, another postgraduate student who wasn't able to make it today. So Stuart's stepping in with his postgraduate hat on, I suppose. And chairing the session, I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Peter Kilroy, who's a new British Academy Fellow at the Menzies Centre, looking at Torres Strait documentary film, or remediations and Torres Strait documentary film. So there's a new mate and a new associate with the Menzies Centre, working also with film studies here at King's, and it's a really exciting addition to the Menzies Centre to have a 3-year funded postdoctoral fellow working with us. Take it away.
Thank you. So welcome back to the final session. It's been a long day, and you all have the thirsty look of beleaguered academics waiting free wine. So we'll... oh yes, yeah, true professional. So we won't keep you too long, but what we're going to do, let me just first of all introduce the other members on the panel. So as Ian was saying, I'm a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Menzies Centre and also the Film Studies Department. Beside me is Helen Idle, who's also a part of the Menzies Centre, and we also have Stuart Ward as well, who's from the Centre for Australian Studies at the University of Copenhagen. And so what we're going to do in a very kind of loose conversational format is to offer some thoughts and reflections on today's theme and on today's sets of themes. And this is less with a view to summarising the sessions and more with a view to opening up dialogues. I think today's event and all of the events that are going to be coming and associated with this event are about creating dialogues both now and in the future, and both within King's and beyond. I think that's quite important to remember. So we're going to speak for about half of the time, or thereabouts. I can't see the clock, but we'll work it out. Then I'm going to open it up to the floor, and I'm sure you've got lots of things that you'd like to say. And then those of you who want to join us afterwards, who have registered for the reception, can continue the dialogue over an ill-advised liquid dinner in the downer room of Australia House at, it's 6:15, is that right? Yeah. Okay, so let me start off, if I may, with a theme that I think was importantly developed this morning, particularly in Agnieszka's talk. It was mentioned last night as well, and it's a theme that has circulated through many of the papers today, and that's the theme of relationality. Now, I'm speaking as a cultural studies practitioner who happens to be working on Australian themes, and the extent to which that makes what I do Australian studies is open to question. But this theme of relationality is quite important. It seems to me, anyway, that Australian studies has historically positioned itself in a set of relations to that which is beyond it. And I'm thinking in disciplinary terms, but most obviously in geographical terms. So Australia's relationship to Europe and Britain in particular, Australia's relationship to Asia and the Pacific region. And what the Menzies Centre is doing, and where Australian studies is seemingly going, is radically expanding the scale of that type of relationality out towards much wider geographical, historical, and ecological scales. And there are considerable advantages in doing so in terms of positioning Australia on the global scale, asking larger ecological questions, and in particular asking questions about Australia's historical antiquity. All of which are very important, and I endorse the project. But let me just play devil's advocate for a moment and ask what potential risks or losses may there be associated with such an expansion, such a relationality, in terms of a loss of focus, for example, or a loss of methodological specializations that have historically contributed to the field of Australian studies. So I suppose my question is to the other members of the panel, does Australian studies always need to be relational? And what would that relationality look like? Are we talking about comparative projects like the ones you mentioned earlier on? Are we talking about parallel projects, or are we talking about more intermeshed projects where Australia is directly linked to other parts of the world?
Okay. All right. Yes, what does it have to be? One thing I do feel is very important is that this thing has to end on a positive note. So let's try and see where we can go with that question. Because perhaps one of the recurring themes of the whole day, certainly the morning session, was that Australian studies is challenged in terms of its critical practice, perhaps even threatened by the new cosmopolitan transnational research agendas that insist upon connectivity and so forth. And I think Agnieszka referred to an apocalyptic pall that hangs over the practice of Australian studies. It doesn't get a lot worse than that, I think, folks. Short of being actually dead, I think it's a fairly serious or parlous state to be in. So I wonder whether Australian studies as critical practice, is there not a role, I guess, for Australian studies, area studies, to perhaps critique and counter-challenge this transnational or interplanetary buzz, and perhaps insist on the enduring purchase of the nation out there, and hence the enduring purpose of actually giving nation or retaining a national imperative within your analytical optics. I mean, goodness, we're in Britain at the moment where you've had the Nationalist Party in Scotland has just gone from strength to strength and almost managed to get enough people over the line to separate itself. You've got UKIP surging ahead, which is really a surrogate English nationalist party. And I could go on and on about the ways in which the popular sense of alienation that is rooted in all kinds of global economic and commercial and other imperatives are leading people to ask questions about the relation of the self to the community. And nation is surely not dead. So I wonder whether Australian studies, rather than just accepting the prima facies of these kinds of research imperatives, should perhaps be sort of holding up a sign and saying, well, actually, there's life in the old dog yet. I mean, I would argue myself as a practitioner of transnational history. I'm not sure if I ever wrote anything that wasn't somehow transnational. That said, I'm sometimes uneasy about the liberationist rhetoric in which it is often packaged. That is to say, the nation is hidebound, it is blinkered, it is inhibiting, that it closes us off to all kinds of other wonderful pastures, as though every history that was ever written from von Ranke to Fukuyama was completely steeped and slavishly harnessed to the ideology and optics of nation. Well, that's patently and demonstrably not the case. I only need to invoke names like Broydell, Hugh Thomas, William McNeill. Our own Carl Bridge is not someone who you could accuse of being slavishly attached to Australia as the sole purpose of his career over the last several decades. So I think at times there's a tendency with the new buzz, the interplanetary buzz, to perhaps overstate the novelty. But also, I think and more to the point, a failure to turn the same critique of the teleology of nation onto the teleology of transnation. We might ask, are we no different from the nationalists in seeking to project or map our own contemporary, global, transnational, and cosmopolitan sensibilities onto a past that may or may not fit the garb? At least not without doing great epistemic violence, to invoke another great buzzword, to our understanding of all kinds of social and historical phenomena, like the transformative power of nationalism in the 19th century. I mean, it happened and it was important. So I don't think, I should make one thing very clear, I don't think that resisting transnational research agendas is the way forward for Australian studies.
No, it's more just about it's a kind of a methodological question about what are the pluses and minuses of approaching it that way. And it's not about rejecting that, but methodologically, in some cases, if you focus on the small scale, the large scale emerges. So you might do a very microscopic study of a tiny community that has a mining company involved, and you're already telling a global story through a very small scale. So my concern is taking a very wide scale and losing out on some of the smaller pictures which actually tell a global story as well. So I'm just trying to play devil's advocate with it and say there are other ways of going big. There are other ways of invoking the global.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily see it in terms of a balance sheet, in terms of weighing up the pluses and minuses and then sort of proceeding from that base. Rather, I'm just appealing for greater self-awareness about what we think we're doing. What do I think I mean when I say transnational? It's not necessarily an inherent and unalloyed progressive thing to say or do. In fact, arguably, the very use of that kind of language, cosmopolitanism, transnationalism, is an idea. I mean, the idea of the transnational goes all the way back to Randolph Bourne in the First World War, but then it was forgotten for several decades and was resurrected and really starts to buzz in the late 1990s. And it does so at the very time that you have a global anti-globalisation movement, where the older discourses of neo-colonialism are being reconstituted in the language of anti-globalisation, where we start to become aware that globalisation brings all kinds of iniquities and all kinds of inequalities. And so transnationalism, I see, as a concept that comes into vogue to provide academics with a progressive way of talking about globalisation, a way of talking about globalisation that doesn't necessarily connote all of these unseemly or unwelcome connotations of globalisation. So it's not about, to get back to your question, I think it's about, it's not about a balance sheet, it's about what is your research problem?
Yeah.
What are you trying to find out? And choose your methodology to go with it, and choose it in a self-aware way, not because you've got some idea that you're only going to get funding if you put transnational in your research approach.
But take up on that point about starting your project. I mean, the reason why I'm working within Australian studies is that I'm looking at at Indigenous art displayed in Europe, and no other institution that I approached in the UK was interested in thinking about Indigenous art as contemporary art. So Australian studies made a space for me to approach and made a space for me to think about it in that way. So I think that's my appreciation of it, really.
So are there any other themes that you thought were relevant that you might like to bring up?
Lots, but does anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah.
Greatly. I think I want to just pick up something that Helen's just said there, actually, in the context of the other debate. And that is that, in a sense, for all of the considerable age in Australian studies, as we learned at the start from Frank's long before, that it's still, when we think about, say, Australian literature, we're still thinking about a tradition or a canon in formation. There's still actually a lot of scholarship that hasn't been done on Australian literature as Australian literature at this very moment when we're trying to then network it and look outwards. So I completely agree with Stuart that actually the way that Australian literary scholarship has been undertaken has always been transnational, really. So there's that, but I think there is this tension, I suppose, within Australian disciplinary work, Australian history, Australian literature, that we are both trying to forge a topic that will then have its own kind of associations, its institutions, its scholarship that will lay the groundwork then for the kinds of ideas that we might more associate with other older disciplines, if you like. For me, though, there's another catchphrase that we haven't had come up so much, which is the Anthropocene. And it interests me that when we're talking about the transnational trend from the 1990s, this is precisely the time when DNA research finally really confirmed that we're all the same species and that we all come out of Africa. Okay? So this is a very recent big change in paleoanthropology. So this connects then, I think, to this question, particularly in the humanities, that's really quite transformative, I think. Mainly because we've been so focused on issues of race and the politics of race, with very good reason. Suddenly that we're getting the confirmation for the first time from the scientific angle that race is genetically negligible, or it's not there at all. It doesn't make any. We are all completely genetically similar. In fact, as a species, we are remarkably genetically similar compared to other species. So this brings in this question, the kind of eco-questions that we've been talking about, that it's a species history that we're talking. We're talking about a long history of immigration, migration, a long history of cultures of inscription, which really transform the way that we think about literature altogether. But again, this is something that in Australian studies we've already been doing. We've been trying to connect up and think about Indigenous painting, Indigenous art as a form of inscription, as a form of writing. So, but what the planetary enables us to do, first of all, I agree, it enables us to produce a different vision of planetary life that isn't about economic globalisation. That's the big argument when she comes to talk about But it also enables us to not disavow the politics of race in Australia, but to think about them slightly differently. So to get away a little bit from the Indigenous, non-Indigenous binary, which has so fueled a lot of our work, but is now not doing the kind of intellectual work that I think it was previously doing. It's still interesting that we don't need to always play that. And I certainly know from Kellen's work, for example, that in drawing Indigenous art into comparison with European art, that this kind of allows us to think about it slightly outside of the politicised racial terms that we've been used to thinking about. So that for me is a kind of liberationary aspect of transnational work, but I completely recognise that it has to be held in tension with the need to still build our discipline.
Picking up on that a little, I'd like to put on the table the notion of the trans-Indigenous as a developing theoretical framework which I think can very productively be brought into Australian studies, and some work has been written on this in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US, and I think that it kind of it keeps the Indigenous in a place where we are aware and wanting to engage with it, but like Ian has just mentioned, it's not necessarily premised on the idea that within the nation it's Indigenous, non-Indigenous kind of binary. And in relation to that, I would also like to propose that the cosmopolitan be thought a little differently as well, not necessarily in terms of, you know, the global mobility-enabled scholar, artist, whoever, but cosmopolitanism should alert us to the idea that we need to be culturally open to the people in our own nation and develop a cultural sensibility and knowledge that allow us to cross over or to have those crossover dialogues. And just as I wrap this up, Nigel Clark, who's a cultural geologist, not geographer, has done some very interesting work on the idea of mobility and cosmopolitanism as being a kind of something that he sees as a possible time-based sort of vertical paradigm where the idea of mobility and cosmopolitanism is about staying put and enduring through time. And he's able to use that as an entree into a discussion of Aboriginality in Australia that argues for the cultural changes and the kind of mobility that we so often associate with the global traveller. And I think all of those things could usefully be brought into dialogue with the concepts that we bring to bear on Australian studies when we're trying to go beyond the nation and to look outside. So the trans-Indigenous and the cosmopolitan as being something that we can slant differently from our position as Australians and not necessarily go directly with the European histories of those terms and concepts.
Does anyone else want to
Yes, it's related, and I think it comes back to some of the points that Stuart was making. In some ways, it strikes me that all of these debates about transnationality and national accounts, it comes down to audience, and who your audience is, who you perceive your audience to be. From today's discussion, it seems to be there are very different audiences out there for Australian studies. Right. A lot of the discussion today is focused around an audience of academics who are inherently transnational, fragmented, sceptical about the idea of the nation. But then there's also an audience in Australia for Australian studies, which is perhaps very different, a popular audience and also a student audience. And in a country like Britain as well, I think, again, it's a completely different audience with an appetite for knowing about Australian history and culture. And the sorts of transnational and national stories we're able to tell vary dramatically for those different audiences.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned of the Emperor sounds very interesting because, you know, the historian who's done more than anyone to popularise, to explore that concept of the Pesh Chakrabarti. In the most recent issue of History Australia, he writes an account of how he came around to that interest, and it was through visiting Canberra during the drought in 2003. And of course, Depeche worked in Australia for many years, visits every year, has continued to engage with Australia. And to me, that's really, in a sense, one of the ways in which Australian studies can work. You know, it takes the local, it takes the particular, and it inserts the particular into really big debates in history. And of course, the other great example of this in Australia, when we talk about the planetary, well, you know, big history was invented in North Ryde. It was invented by David Christian at Macquarie University, and that is absolutely revolutionising the way in which history is being taught in schools. I mean, this is the idea that, you know, history, you know, really is if we want to understand we're in much longer time frames, we begin with the Big Bang. And, you know, this is beginning to have a really serious, particularly around pedagogy, it's having a serious impact. This was done from Australia, and you have to wonder, you know, historians in Australia do think, they're forced to think about timescales in quite distinct ways, I think. Is it an accident that big history emerged from Australia? And there's another, I think, great example of the ways in which I suspect a very local way of thinking about time has again been deployed in really big global debates that are really revolutionising the way in which we think about history. And I mean, I'm not suggesting that's the only way of doing Australian studies, and it's the only usefulness of Australian studies. But I think, you know, that is one of the ways in which Australian studies can work, is by taking that local and perhaps being inspired by the local and bringing it to bear in those sorts of debates and situations.
Tom Briggs too.
Yeah, Tom's a good example of someone working around those issues.
I don't quite know how to formulate this comment, but maybe it's a question, I'm not sure. But yeah, I as someone who's, you know, interested in world literature and Australian literature in relation to that way of thinking, that paradigm of going, and transnational readings and so on. I can understand its attractions, but I'm also aware that this is a moment when some Aboriginal people are thinking the most important thing for them is what is the foundation of the nation, and that's been true since Mabo, and it's been true before that for them obviously, but since Mabo it's got a kind of political cultural urgency, which is currently focused on recognition for First Nation people, Indigenous people, Aboriginal people within the Constitution. And in relation to some of those comments earlier, Noel Pearson at the moment is, I heard him talk last week about, well, the whole idea of basing, what is it, section 25, basing special recognition for Aboriginal people on the basis of race, which is what that section says, was a misstep, was wrong. And he says that one of the challenges, this is just Noel Pearson, and the essay says the same thing, one of the challenges at the moment is to try and convince the Australian people broadly that race and indigeneity are two different things. And race is what we actually go. We have to forget that, because that's not the basis on which an updated Australian sentiment, which is recognised Aboriginal people, can be made. So all those things are, they're about the constitutional section, about how you deal with a neoliberal right that will revolt. How do you convince that? On the other hand, as Noel Pearson says, the only way in which Australia is going to get recognition for Aboriginal people in the Constitution is if it's led by the right, because otherwise it's going to happen. And Aboriginal people are completely realistic about that. that's a discourse about the very basic elements, the legal elements, the judicial elements of the nation, sovereignty. And I think sometimes in the academic realm we tend to kind of not recognise the ways in which those issues and questions are being put.
Question down here. Thanks very much to the panel.
I'm Ben Mountford. I'm a postdoc in history at Oxford. I just wanted to come back quickly to Stuart's point about being optimistic, and to Frank's point.
Optimistic comment.
I mean, it just strikes me that, and it's natural, I think, that we do this. We often kind of over-problematise the threat of something like global history to something like Australian studies. And I think you make a valid point that the sort of notion of complete liberation is not a trap we want to fall into. But I think most global historians would actually concede that what they want to do relies very much on the sum of its parts. And it relies on being built on particular expertise which is grounded in regions or areas. And I think particularly Australia and New Zealand, I mean, if you just look at the last few years, have offered, I mean, you only need to look at the two chairs now in global and imperial history at Oxford and Cambridge, one being a Kiwi and one being an Australian, you know, who have both kind of evolved to their sense of global studies from a particular Antipodean slant. And so I got the sense today there was a little bit of anxiety about the sort of threat of global studies and global history, and I wonder if maybe Frank's point about it being actually an advantage to have this sort of Antipodean perspective that maybe has a slightly different calculation in terms of geography, time, connections, is not actually a strategic advantage for Australian studies over some other regional studies.
I can just respond and say, you know, I didn't mean to say that there's no threat, hunky-dory, continue as according to your schedule. I think that actually Agnieszka in particular, her diagnosis of the state of place in Australia was actually pretty spot on. So it was more a way of trying to say, well, you know, do we simply accept the prima facies of that, or is there some scope for Australian studies to actually find ways of articulating problems of nation and nationhood that need not be ruled out of court simply because of their optics or their methodology isn't, you know, sufficiently fashionable.
Perhaps if I might just throw in a comment. I thought my paper was actually optimistic, and I think it's interesting that you're focusing on the apocalypse, because the way that I was thinking is actually quite similar to what Ben was just saying, this idea that Australian studies in a way has a particular viewpoint which and strategic advantages, a way of looking at global history from a particularly Antipodean viewpoint, which does bring this sort of complexity of region, of different timeframes, and of I mean, nationalism, yes, I agree also with your point that you should, the research question needs to sort of point towards the frames, which again was something that I was trying to say. If we say Australian studies, we immediately have to focus on that framing. You know, what does Australian mean? Are we looking at the nation? Does the nation make sense for that topic? Or is the nation, I mean, the irony is, of course, that nations are transnational. The 19th century was the rise of nationhood, yes, but in the same way across many different places. So that, you know, the very concept of a nation needs to be problematized and globalized in and of itself in some topics, not all topics. So yeah, I think my point was optimistic, and I do think in the end I said, yes, there is a future for Australian studies because of that advantage that we have, I think, in naturally problematizing the concept of nation. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's no such thing as nation. There's only transnational, and I'm certainly not doing it because it's trendy. I think that this is something that has intellectual thrust behind it.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to caricature you as the prophet of doom. It was more the entire session, and you happened to use the word apocalypse, which is why it was an easy shorthand for what was a more general kind of foreboding sort of picture, particularly for Australian studies in Australia. I don't think Australian studies here or where we are, or certainly in Asia, is subject to the same kinds of difficulties. I even sometimes wonder whether, you know, I hear it's not just about Australian studies programs closing. It's also about Australian literature programs, Australian history programs having difficulty attracting students You know, I wonder why that is and why that's the case and why it's not the case for us or in Dublin. It's not hard to attract students. I remember asking a group of Dublin students why they were doing Australian history, and they said, "Oh, it's just so great that we don't have to do another course about Ireland," because they get stuck all through their schooling with Irish history, and so they come to university and they want to choose that. And I wonder whether Australian studies in Australia is a victim of its own success, in the sense that all the trajectories that Frank sort of mapped out for us were trickling down to the the secondary education system. So maybe students are coming to university and having exactly the same impulse. I was really struck when you said that you changed the name of that course from Australian Studies to Australia and the World, because of course you were implicitly offering them something else, something other than Australia that's not what they're necessarily the convicts or whatever it is that they're sick of hearing about in school. That's not the case for Australian Studies centres elsewhere. Simon talked about different audiences, and I think we do have different audiences, and rather than talk about Australian Studies' future, it really is about futures, because we will all be developing that line of business in different contexts and connecting up in different ways to different local agendas.
Yeah, I just got a couple of comments. The comment earlier about relationality and the way that Australian Studies really depends on where it's located in terms of how it's approached and what is actually being studied. And I know that, for example, in the US, the Australian Studies centres and the individuals who work on Australian Studies, they often have a requirement, an institutional requirement, that their approach to Australian Studies is a comparative one between the United States and Australia, and that's part of the purpose why the centre was funded and exists in the first place. And then I was thinking about this, what I sense is a lot of anxiety regarding the relationship between Australian Studies and Australian nationalism. And I think part of what we need to figure out is, if we are studying Australia, especially from outside Australia, does that necessarily mean that we are somehow promoting Australia or Australian literature or Australian history? And if we are doing that, do we think that's okay, or do we think that it's a bad thing? And even if we're criticising Australian history and Australian literature, are we still somehow promoting it? And personally, like, I see my role in the US in my position as a teacher and also as the president of the association. I see my role as promoting Australian literature, and I'm fine with that. And I'm not a nationalist anymore. I was when I was younger because I was naive. But you know, I've kind of got past that, and I think it's okay, and I think we should kind of embrace it. And there's a lot of anxiety I'm sensing, maybe I'm wrong, about whether or not to acknowledge that part of our role is to promote the study of our own country.
Oh, hello. As a new researcher in Australian studies, I want to respond to what Helen said about Australian studies was that space that allowed her to pursue the research and the project she wanted to. And I think that's something really important. It's not just about literature, it's not just about history, it's about individual projects. Mine in particular, which was mentioned before, is creative practice. And you know, there wasn't a space. There wouldn't have been a space in other Department of King's to do a project quite like that. But you know, that is. I just want to acknowledge the innovation that is within Australian studies, and no matter what it's called, and in fact I quite like being called Australian Studies. So you know, I vote we keep that until I've got my PhD. But after that, I don't care what you do. Yeah, I just wanted to speak to that, because I think that is something that we've got people from film, performing arts here. It's not just about literature, Australian literature and poetry, and it's not just about history. It's about all these other things that none of us have thought of yet.
Just further to what Nat was saying, I think Australian studies must have different purposes and attractions in different contexts. Where I am in Turkey, it is totally about promoting Australia. the university I'm at is next to Gallipoli, and Gallipoli, as you may know, has become a bit of a party scene for or it did become a kind of backpackers meeting place and rave point. And it upset the locals somewhat, and long story short, as a result, the Australian Studies Centre was set up at the university, and various restrictions also were brought in. And it is entirely there about a place where a lot of Australians do attend. I mean, Agnesia's been there too, so she can talk about it too. So it's been interesting because there it is very much, it does have that kind of agenda of cultural exchange and a kind of education. It would be nice if Australian students learned about Turkey as well when they were learning about Anzac Day, perhaps. Anyway, I'm just mentioning that because it seems to me we've had mentions of other reasons why students outside of Australia might be attracted to doing something in the general area of Australian studies, and it's clear that there are a range of reasons and attractions for that, and that there is a place for Australian studies as a kind of soft diplomacy, perhaps.
I think it's really important not to conflate the study of nationalism with being nationalist. They're two different things. So we can promote interest in Australian history, culture, literature with a critical eye on the nation that links it to other national experiences. That's not to be nationalist. And I guess there's another responsibility that we have, which is completely not unrelated to, but it goes beyond our own position. It goes beyond the way in which we think about our own methodology or the future. And that is a responsibility to the students we're teaching. And I would say it's impossible to explain, for example, Australian society in the late 20th century, early 21st century, without looking at nationalism in depth, in detail. Because if you want to understand Australia, and you look at what happened, especially from the mid-90s on with Howard and the whole Anzac so-called resurgence, which is no resurgence, it's a reinvention. It's not a return to anything that was. It's a completely new thing. So you can't explain Australia to students unless you look very, very seriously at the kind of nationalism that has evolved over the last 30 to 40 years. That's not to be nationalist. That's to be, I think, intellectually responsible in a sense of our chief endeavour is to explain a society to others, often to those who don't live there.
Can I just stand up because I'm short? I just want to say, Catherine Gallagher, I've been living here since 1979, and the Australian Studies Centre, which started about 82, has been another home in a way. It's given a window to writers like myself, people coming through, and well, it's just a chance. That's all I want to say, really. It's a place that represents Australia, not only to people like me, who is actually born Australian, but to lots of other people who see it as somewhere, a place that speaks on the radio, on the BBC, Ian and Cowbridge and other people. So it's just something that's really good, and I'm very optimistic about its future. Thank you.
While we're being nice about the Menzies Centre, my name is Amanda Clement, and I did the Masters in Australian Studies, Area Studies, open brackets, Australia, close brackets, in the 90s. So I have read all the books that Frank had up, and all the rest of it. Everything I know about Australia, I learnt from some of the people here, but some people who aren't here, some of the people who went before them. And that took me to Australia to do a PhD, where I found I was the lone researcher doing stuff on Australia. So this place makes me happy. Because Helen's right, and Sheridan too. It gives a possibility. It opened up possibilities of doing the thing, studying things. I didn't even know what I wanted to study. Australia was somewhere I was curious about. I'd read Patrick White. I wanted to know why that place in his writing was so important. I wanted to go to that Australia. I didn't write about Patrick White in my PhD at all. In fact, I have one chapter on literature, even though that's what I thought I was going to do. But I learnt all sorts of different things. And one of the things I really came back with was the possibility of reflecting on being a European and what it means to be here. And I got so much from that because I'm a European, and my first degree is in languages, and it's beginning to dawn on me that possibly I'm quite used to studying other cultures. And Australia is another place, and there are many other cultures and many other landscapes. But if I hadn't been here, I wouldn't have been able to read those landscapes and maybe draw some conclusions from them. And I'm glad the place exists, and I hope all strength to everybody here. Carry on the good work.
We're running out of time. Are we okay?
So these will have to be the last.
Yeah.
So Vera and that's appropriate.
Vera Alexander, I'm at the University of Copenhagen, but I'm actually German, and traditionally we've tended to make first contact with our fellow human beings by telling them what they're doing wrong, which has led to a lot of misunderstandings. I wasn't very happy when I heard that the word studies was going to be dropped. In fact, it was quite a despairing moment because we'd all need new identities, and that's a lot of work. But I've been casting around for alternatives to that, and I think what Stuart was introducing, the search for the positive and for the optimistic, points to the underlying problem that we have not just in the humanities, maybe especially in the humanities, but also in academia, that you almost naturally look more intelligent when you say something negative. So in other words, we haven't quite found a constructive way of using the positive discursively and in terms of methodology. So what about Australia appreciation?
I think, what about Australia, the work?
It makes for a fine app. I mean,
Just before Carl has the last word, I just wanted to remind people of what Barry calls it, and that's dingo studies.
I didn't intend to have the last word, and don't see it as that, but something that Stuart was saying, one or two other things that have been bouncing around the room, this business about nationalism and promoting Australia, there are legitimate ways of doing it and illegitimate ways of doing it. This came to the surface when we were negotiating with the Howard government in 1999 to get the endowment for the Menzies Centre. And there was a minister, an education minister, whose name I've forgotten, but he was at one stage a professor at Monash. Kemp, that's right. And he wanted to write into the agreement that we were to promote Australia. In other words, to sell places in Australian universities and, Australian product. And King's, and we, as the negotiators for King's, completely and utterly rejected that and said we want to study Australia and explain it in terms fitting an academic institution, which means we'll be critical. And that's what people expect, and that's a compliment to all the other things that go on around the place. Now, critical doesn't necessarily mean negative. It simply means coming to the table and trying to explain things. That's what we're all in the business of trying to do in our different ways, and we should do it in lots of different ways. Otherwise, we're not doing our job. And it's a positive thing to do it, even if it involves being negative.
Well, time is caught up with us, I'm afraid. These are all good, positive notes to end on. I think you'll agree that this has been a spectacular relaunch of the centre. And I want to first ask you to join me in thanking Ian and Sheridan and the other organisers of what has been a really wonderful, critical and engaging day. Thank you very much.